interest in Iran. I'd like to welcome you all this evening. We've seen extraordinary superficial or not superficial changes in Iran's foreign policy in the last year, culminating in that extraordinary agreement that came out of Geneva that appears to herald some sort of real rapprochement between Iran and the West, and most extraordinarily, Iran and the United States. I think we're going to try and gaze into the future a little bit tonight, having perhaps some observations from our panelists, some of whom have been in Iran very recently, to try and determine where we're headed. It's the crystal ball is very cloudy at this stage. I should mention now that the roving microphones that we normally use for people to ask questions are broken. So when I do open the floor to questions, can you stand up, say, introduce yourself, and then speak very loudly so everybody can hear the question. I'll begin by introducing our panelists this evening. Ramita Navai is a documentary maker. She was the Times Tehran correspondent, and she's just written a book based on the lives of some people who live in Tehran. It's out in May, I believe. It's called The City of Lies. Sir Richard Dalton, who was the British ambassador to Iran between 2003 and 6?
2 and 6. Yes.
2 and 6. And now a fellow at Chatham House, specializing in Middle Eastern and North African security. On my immediate right, Aaron Reza Merat, who was the Economist Tehran correspondent and now works for the Economist Intelligence Unit. And he's going to be able to talk to us a little bit about Iran's economy. On my left, Shashank Joshi, research fellow at RUSI and also doctoral candidate at Harvard, I believe, specializing in security matters in the Middle East. And finally, on my far left, Kelly Niknejad, who is the editor-in-chief of Tehran Bureau, which was a virtual news bureau and an invaluable source of information about what was going on inside Iran, especially when the walls were up and the doors were closed, and it was very difficult to find out what was really going on. She is still running the Tehran Bureau, but now from The Guardian, which is hosting her project. I'm going to begin by asking our panelists to give a little bit of a statement, whatever you like to address, in, say, 4 minutes each, and then we'll proceed with questions. Perhaps you'd like to begin.
Sure. I think that there's undoubtedly been change for the good in Iran. So I think the easing of the sanctions has stabilized the economy. And I think, in turn, with planefuls of businessmen, foreign businessmen wanting to invest, I think that's in turn has helped the morale of a certain sector of Iranian society. However, I think that the reality on the streets of Tehran is that there's been far less change than I think people in the West imagine. I think that's partly to do with the fact that what's really changed is the way Iran is presenting itself to the international community rather than how it's treating and dealing with its own people. That's why I think it's really important to talk about what hasn't changed. Civil society hasn't changed. Amnesty International has just reported that since the beginning of this year, there have been 40 executions. So executions are still happening at an alarming rate. Newspaper industry in Iran, it's business as usual, which means every now and again a newspaper is shut, and that hasn't changed since Rohani Bahar newspaper has been shut, and 2 reformist newspapers that were due to open have been banned from opening. Under Ahmadinejad, BBC Persian journalists, their families were being harassed. Guess what? They're still being harassed. I think most significantly, Iran's 2 most famous political prisoners, Mousavi and Karoubi, are still under house arrest. Now, what this means is not that Rouhani doesn't want change, but that real meaningful change that's going to trickle down, that you're going to be able to see on the streets of Tehran, is going to be very slow to happen, and also that he's got a real fight on his hands, that he's going to be blocked by the hardliners. as what happened to Khatami. And you can see this on TV, you can hear it on the radio, you can see it on the streets. I'll give you an example. The day after the historic phone call between Obama and Rouhani, posters sprung up all across Tehran. There was one at the bottom of my road with the strapline, "Honesty US Styles," classic Iranian typo. And there were lots of different images. My favorite was hands coming to shake. One was Iranian and one was American. And the American hand was the clawed hand of the devil. So, you know, he has got a real fight on his hands. Having made my points, I want to sum up by saying I still believe, having said all of this, that he is the man who can change things. He's a real insider. So you probably know this, but for over 20 years, nearly 20 years, he was the Supreme Leader's representative at the Supreme National Security Council. Part of the council's job is to formulate nuclear policy. So he really knows how to negotiate the hardliners. He really knows what's happening in there. And also, of course, he's in favor with the big man, with the Supreme Leader. So I think if anyone is our hope for change, even though it hasn't happened really yet, it is Rouhani.
Thank you very much. You came in under 4 minutes, too.
Oh, great.
Oh, extraordinary. All right, Killy.
I agree with a lot of what Ramita is saying, and I'm going to qualify everything I say that, by emphasizing that this is the view of people that are there. It's not my view where I say, okay, things look great, everyone's breathing, and just based on the kind of information and submissions I'm getting from inside Iran, I can tell there's a difference. But people who are there, the initial optimism that came with Rouhani's win is definitely wearing off. You know, when he released a group of prominent political prisoners and others before his UN trip, hopes went up that he was going to free Karoubi, Mousavi, and his wife. And when he didn't, you know, that really, they were hoping he would do that and legitimize an election that they had taken part of, and you know, they helped legitimize the Islamic Republic after what happened 4 years ago. So that didn't happen. And in terms of personal freedoms and standards of living, everything has gotten worse. From the experience of our correspondents, their access and you know, to the internet and the speed of the internet is down. The price of food is climbing. The pollution is worse than ever. A lot of people who said that they were going to go, even a lot of the exiles who said they were going to go back a few months ago, they didn't go back, are not going back. And even though the intelligence ministry has put on a more friendly face, for example, they made an announcement recently that, you know, as Rouhani keeps inviting exiles to go back to Iran, they said, okay, why don't exiles can send an email to the intelligence and ask if there's an open case against them so that if they go back to Iran. But anyways, they didn't go back to Iran. But at the same time, the IRGC intelligence unit, which is much stronger and much more important than the actual intelligence ministry, they've actually have, you know, stepped up their activities a lot, and they are targeting journalists and bloggers, not just inside Iran, outside of Iran. And they're letting, even though the ones that I'm talking about, which are not the BBC, but others, they haven't been threatening their families like they were under Ahmadinejad, but they're letting them know that they're still there, that they are listening to their phone calls, that they're tapped. And in some cases, there have been examples to actually you know, show that they're just not threatening it, that they're actually doing so. So that's going on. And then on the economic side, even though the government is trying to boost consumer morale and attract investment, purchasing power of Iranians is 6 times less than it was 3 years ago. So there's not much that they can do. And in terms of investment, they've been focusing on oil and the automotive industry. But aside from that, they've been vague about the kind of investment they want, which kind of implicates that the privatization of the Iranian economy and the fact that the IRGC, again, has a very strong chokehold on the economy is not going to go away. So that's also disheartening. And I don't know, am I going over a little bit? Okay. And basically, the legacy of the past 8 years is going to continue regardless of Rouhani or anybody else, because based on some recent corruption cases like Babak Zanjani, people are very hesitant. They're not very optimistic. They saw that even any kind of foreign investment really benefits just a few at the top, and very little, if anything, trickles down. And it's better to try to think in terms of a short-term strategy instead of a long-term one. So if you can rip the government off or rip somebody else off, that's a better plan than trying to start a small business. And a lot of the kids that came of age during the past 8 years don't even have the little experience of the generation before them that saw a little bit of Khatami's, Tehran Spring, where there were some freedoms, there was some civil society. Without that, they have actually nothing to, they don't even think like the generation before them. They've never had to apply themselves to the labor force because there have been no jobs, and they haven't even had that taste of freedom. So that in itself is a chronic problem that is going to continue regardless of anything else.
Thank you very much. Aaron.
Hello, everyone. So I just want to start by saying that the election of a new president in Iran is extraordinarily different to the election of a new president elsewhere. Iran's got a very esoteric, you might even say peculiar political system whereby policy is basically hammered out by gaining elite consensus, and a lot of it's too early to say how well Rouhani is really faring. It's kind of like turning a massive oil tanker and trying to work out what it's going to be like much further down the line. The only thing we can really be sure about is that Rouhani and the executive branch has got a mandate by the Supreme Leader to really push through rapprochement with the West in order to gain sanctions relief in exchange for some nuclear transparency, of which we will find out later on this year exactly what that entails. Now, the rest is kind of up for debate, and there are clues about where Iran will go. So, take for example the oil industry. Now, Rouhani has employed a oil minister who had the same portfolio back in the time of Khatami, back in the late 90s, and this gentleman by the name of Bijan Zanganeh, he really wants to turn Iran's oil industry into a much more commercial, decentralized, much more kind of savvy institution, and really unmoored from the ideology which kind of pervaded it under Ahmadinejad. Now, in order to do this, he's really got to fight against some vested interests, because foreign capital and expertise essentially left Iran when a very, very bonkers UN resolution was placed on Iran in 2006, which was followed by more UN resolutions, which sanctioned Iran's oil sector and sanctioned Iran's and basically deprived Iran of a lot of foreign exchange. Now, what he wants to do is, if he needs to make Iran more savvy, he needs to basically privatize a lot of the vested interests, which include the Revolutionary Guards engineering arm Khat al-Anbiya. And they are going to put up a fight, and we're going to have to really see how this plays out. The other areas of, the other clues which we've got from what's happened over the last 6 months or so is the Syria policy. Now, a lot of people in the West think that the Iranian-Syrian policy is de facto supporting President Assad to the hilt. Now, it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that, because back in the early days of the Syrian civil war, there were a few mullahs and a few very high-ranking members of the political system who really spoke out about Iran's Syria policy, because for several reasons, President Bashar al-Assad is not popular among the Iranian public, and also it's sort of against Iran's national security and wider strategic regional interests to back Assad to the hilt. The costs of supporting Assad have outweighed the benefits. The benefits used to be it was part of the Iranian revolutionary rhetoric about supporting a regional resistance axis against Zionist and US hegemony in the region. Now the situation's looking kind of different. Iran's baby Hezbollah is being bled in the battlefields of Syria. It's being completely discredited from its high in 2006 when it defeated Israel in the Lebanese war. And the famed land corridor which Iran needs to supply weapons to Syria is essentially closed because there's a civil war going on. It makes Iran look bad supporting a tyrant like Assad. My reading of the situation is that a lot of people in the Iranian executive know this. But the problem they're going to face is that they can't fight these, they don't have a political capital to fight these two fronts at the same time. Rapprochement with the West and pushing away Assad at the same time, it's kind of revolutionary suicide for the Islamic Republic. They need to do one at a time. He's been mandated with the power to have a détente with the West, but only really after they have a nuclear deal, if they have a nuclear deal, will they be able to start turning their attention to transforming Syria. And at the moment, there are some signs that they're willing to do this. How am I on time?
You're
Over.
a little bit.
Okay, I'll close quite quickly. There are some signs. For example, former President Rafsanjani has provided a few olive branches to Saudi Arabia, leading me at least to the conclusion that that's the way Iran is going to deal with Syria. They really want to be having a side, possibly private conversation with the Saudis. And in order to do that, they need to really get over a lot of bad blood. But that's how I see Syria really being closed, at least from Iran's perspective. I just want to close with one thing. Rouhani's success might ironically be to the disservice of the Islamic Republic as a whole, because the Islamic Republic as a system might not be reformable. In the same way Gorbachev thought that he could try and reform the Soviet Union, but was actually a principal player in its undoing. The hardliners may have a point. I mean, it may be a very self-interested point, but they may see Rouhani as a threat for the undoing of the entire system. And I think that this is the real critical kind of existential challenge Iran faces these days, whether or not the Islamic Republic can be reformed in any meaningful way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sir Richard, would you like to go next?
Do you want to?
Oh, or did you want to go next?
Yeah, please. Sure, yeah.
All right.
So I'll start with the nuclear deal and say a word on that, which I think follows very nicely from the opening presentations. I mean, the nuclear deal we had in November and that was finally implemented as of January 20th, the so-called Joint Plan of Action, as it was called, it was the biggest breakthrough for 10 years in the nuclear dispute. And it was distinguished from any past deals we've had, short-term deals between the Europeans and the Iranians, by the very fact that the Americans were at the table. Whereas in the past the Americans were on the outside and therefore were not supporting diplomacy from within. And the real significance of that deal isn't so much what it substantively achieves towards Iran's program, because it's mostly a freeze. It freezes most elements of Iran's program, but really two other things. And the first is that it stops the clock. It stops the clock at a very sensitive moment in terms of Iran's addition of nuclear capacity, the ability to enrich more uranium in short periods, and a freeze on how much uranium it was accumulating, and therefore eases these concerns that were mounting in Western capitals, and notably in Washington and in Israel, about the speed with which Iran could hypothetically break out for a nuclear weapon. But even more than that, I think it untangles what was one of the thorniest knots in the dispute, which was Iran's claimed right to enrich uranium. Those UN Security Council resolutions that Aaron mentioned all demanded that Iran suspend enrichment. Iran said no, it has an inalienable right to enrich under the terms of the NPT. And what the Geneva deal did very astutely was give both sides a way out of this. It said it promised Iran a mutually defined enrichment program, which sounds very technical, but essentially allows each side to come away claiming it's won. The Americans could say Iran does not have an inalienable right because we have to give it consent as to how big its program can be, what it can do, and the Iranians can say, well, we're going to have an enrichment program that presupposes the right, so we can sell this back at home. And the furious spinning by both sides, by John Kerry in Washington and by Foreign Minister Zarif in Tehran, shows you how each side has come away from this being able to sell this. And I think that's the essence of good diplomacy, far from being something that it represents a breakdown of diplomacy. The other point on this is that Iran is getting quite little here. You can correct me on the numbers, Aaron, but I mean, the sanctions relief amounts to about $7 billion, which is pretty small compared to the $30 billion or so it's losing in foregone oil revenue over the course of the 6-month period of the deal. So this is a relatively modest bit of sanctions relief. Most sanctions remain completely in place, and all of the buzz you see with foreign investors going to Iran, delegations looking at opportunities, these are no more than buzz. That is, the cost of violating these sanctions is still going to be very, very high for anyone who attempts to do so. Finally, as anyone, I think, who's followed Israel-Palestine knows, going from an interim deal to a final deal is very, very hard. It's very difficult to turn these deals from one to the other. President Obama has said the prospects of doing this are no more than 50-50. And it's worth just mentioning, I think, the serious obstacles that exist on both sides to this. In the US, we have a bill going through Congress, the Menendez-Kirk bill, that has 59 co-sponsors in the Senate, which is very significant because it means if you have eight more sponsors, senators who sign on to this, Congress can theoretically override a presidential veto and impose further sanctions, which would kill off the diplomacy at this very early stage. Obama has said he would veto a bill, but in theory his veto can be overridden by Congress, something that I think hasn't happened on a foreign policy issue since Congress overrode Reagan's veto on sanctions against South Africa in the 80s. In Iran, of course, MPs would probably also insist on voting on a final agreement, certainly on aspects of inspections, and again, that could also derail this inside Iran. Finally, I think the one thing that unites those who hate the deal and those who love the deal is that both have a propensity to see this as the thin end of a wedge to a bigger rapprochement. And I'm not sure I see this. I think I would be closer to your view. I mean, in Davos, where President Rouhani was speaking last week, he suggested that the reopening of the US embassy would not be completely implausible at this stage. So, even the president himself is raising these pretty high expectations. But I think, as Aaron put it, his mandate is to ease isolation for economic reasons, for economic renewal. It is not a mandate for unconditional friendship with the West. There are areas where Iran and Western interests overlap. I would put Afghanistan on that list with the withdrawal of foreign forces and the potential resurgence of the Taliban, a common enemy of Iran and the West. But there are enormous number of places where that bad blood remains well beyond Syria. That includes Bahrain, it includes Yemen, it includes Iraq, it includes Lebanon, where a new government is trying to be formed, and Syria, of course, is only the most intractable of those various issues. And in my view, what we're probably going to see, if I'm sticking my neck out, is progress on the nuclear deal. We will see an agreement, a successor deal here, maybe not a final one, but another interim agreement. But we'll actually see comparatively little progress on these other issues, and very possibly a worsening of the Saudi-Iran relationship, rather than the sort of détente that you would need to ease these broader range of issues.
Can I ask you one supplementary? Do you think that the Supreme Leader has shifted his position enough to allow the degree of rapprochement we've seen? Because of the economic pressure alone?
No, I think that the election, probably those who understand Iran's domestic politics are better placed to speak on this, but I think the election of Rouhani was itself representative of shifting winds. And I think we tend to confuse the Supreme Leader's status within Iran as being he has the only say. He may have the final say, but it's not the only say, and he exercises his veto on issues, including on foreign policy issues, with an eye on the domestic political balance as well. And Rouhani's election and the rise of those more pragmatic tendencies signaled a change in the political atmosphere within Iran, and I think the Supreme Leader acts within those boundaries. Sanctions played a part in that, but so too did the rise of pragmatic elements who simply saw that Ahmadinejad's path was not leading Iran to anything good.
Thank you. To finish up, Sir Richard.
Well, I agree with what my colleagues have said. I think they're reading the situation inside Iran in the way that I would. And the view that Aaron took of the mandate given to Rouhani being primarily an economic one is absolutely right. And I agree with Shawshank that a nuclear deal is doable. I think that one should look at the historic perspective of where Iran is today. The Iranian Revolution was about freeing a great country from the pressures on its sovereignty and independence. The revolutionary rhetoric was about liberation. And here we have, in 2014, a country which has lost its sovereignty and independence in respect of major decisions about its internal and external future to a quite extraordinary degree. Now, I don't know whether the Supreme Leader would pose his dilemma in those terms, but that is what it actually is. And I think he sees a negotiation as strengthening the Islamic Republic, as continuing the fight to roll back the existential pressures on Iran from Zionism backed by arrogant powers with the United States in the lead. I think he sees stabilizing the domestic situation in Iran, which got out of control during the Ahmadinejad period, as contingent on delivering economic benefits to the people. And he sees now, maybe in a way that he didn't during the Ahmadinejad period, quite how dire the Iranian situation is. And I mean, the outside world, in looking at its opportunities in this situation, has got a genuine dilemma, because the Iranian regime is not one which one would want to see strengthened. One would want to see aspects of the way it treats its own people and the way it behaves in the region weakened, frankly. A lot of what it does is unacceptable. But at the same time, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and above all ensuring that the Iranian program will not be misused in future, is such a high priority issue that there are certain features that are going to go with a solution, which include boosting Iran's growth rate, for example. Where it is now, minus several percent, is not the trend. The trend during the Khatami period was 6 or 7% plus. And that's what Khamenei wants to restore. And in a way, in helping to resolve the nuclear question, we are assisting that process. Justification, in my view, is that actually an Iran that is prospering is an Iran that is more likely to reform long term. But I agree absolutely that Rouhani hasn't spent his career seeking ways to weaken the Islamic Republic. I don't think he is an ideologue, primarily. I think he's interested in what works. And when he talks in terms of moderation and hope and improving Iran's relations with its neighbours, I think we should take him at face value. So the question for outsiders is what combination of policies, and this applies just as much to Saudi Arabia as to the European Union or the United States, what combination of policies will make it more likely that moderation and hope can eventually work its magic both in the Iranian domestic situation and in Iran's relations with its neighbours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, it's your turn now. If you want to address a specific speaker, please say so. And let me remind you to speak up because we have no microphones for you. May I call for questions from the floor? Yeah. Potkin, go ahead. Yes, just shout.
Just tell us about the effects of the new technology in oil excavation and how that's going to change the supply and demand. When is that going to happen, and what will be its impact on Iran's economy? Will it negate some of the concessions that Islamic Republic is gained from the Geneva negotiations?
You want to tackle that?
In terms of oil exploitation, Iran needs foreign capital, it needs foreign expertise. There's simply too many intractable challenges for it to do so on itself. There are huge relatively unexplored heavy oil reserves.
No, I'm talking about the technology of fracturing, for example, which is going to change the supply and demand.
You sort of shale revolution.
Yeah, fracking.
The shale revolution in Iran.
No, not in Iran.
Oh, the shale revolution in the US. I see.
Supply and demand.
Oh, making the U.S. and the West less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but Iranian oil in particular. All right.
The Iranian economy.
I mean, I think that I think that analysis, if you were saying that that was the case, would be a little bit premature. The Americans certainly are definitely playing a little bit faster and looser with their Middle Eastern policy because they do have their own domestic resources and they will be an independent, they will have an independent energy supply within the next few years if they don't already have it. But I think that the world will still demand traditional hydrocarbons from the Gulf littoral states and Iran, and the stakes are still high to try and secure the geopolitical environment in order to have those contracts. So I think that a large reason why the negotiations are taking place are because American oil companies do want into Iran as well. That is still a factor. And the shale gas thing is secondary to that.
Yes. Next question. Yes, Madam.
Rosalind Bain, I've made a few films about Iran, and particularly its nuclear policy. You've spoken very eloquently, everyone, from the point of view of an Iranian point of view outwards in some ways. I think the West needs Iran at the moment, and I think that's one of the major reasons for part of the coming together. What's happened, and I'd like people's comments on this, you've got a situation in Syria where you have Saudis and Qataris arming and financing rebellion, which nobody wants, that has now, in a way, got involved in the civil war in Syria. You have a situation where Israel is frankly doing whatever it wants at the moment. If one looks back at history in terms of Iran's place, you had a situation under the Shah where, in fact, Israel and Iran cooperated against the periphery of Arab countries and of Sunni countries. And I'm quite interested in thinking that actually it's the West's advantage to make deals with Iran in terms of Afghanistan, as been mentioned, in terms of Iraq, that's completely gone bananas at the moment, and there's no way of stopping it. You've got a Kurdish rebellion going on now in the north of Syria with the Syrian Kurds saying they're now independent. In fact, you've actually got a coming together of mutual interests with Iran and with the West, which is in fact in some ways pre-1979.
Thank you very much. Shashank, I know you want to take a
I
run
think
at this.
that's certainly the fear of Saudi Arabia, which says, well, we remember a time when Iran was closer to the US than we were. I think that's vastly overblown. As I said, I think there are areas of common interest, but even in those areas, look at Afghanistan. The Taliban killed many Iranian diplomats in the late 90s, and there's no love lost there. At the same time, Iran has sponsored parts of the insurgency over the past 12 years, and there's no denying that. They have given armed assistance. It's never easy dealing with Iran, even on those areas where those common interests exist. I think Syria is another example. First of all, I think it's really important we also state Iran has provided extensive military assistance to the government of the Assad regime, including in its brutal tactics against Syrian civilians, and that it deserves probably just as much scorn for that. But when we have I mean, I'm very much in favour of talking to Iran about Syria, but what happened at Geneva in the Geneva talks in Montreux over the past 2 weeks, I don't think was a very simple case of the US saying, we won't talk to Iran full stop. The problem really was that Iran didn't quite get on board with the agenda. Now, you could argue that all the other participants in those talks, including Russia and including Saudi Arabia, formally agreed to the idea that, look, we're having some talks and the purpose here is to form a transitional government by mutual consent. All Iran had to do to get a seat at the table, which was unthinkable, I think, about a few months ago, was to accept the Geneva I communique. And that they didn't is quite telling and a sign of those divisions on Syria policy that Aaron was talking about. So I'm not so sure it's a case of we need them and it all follows from there. I mean, if they're on board and they can help moderate each side's external support for competence in Syria, great. But I'm not sure that they're in any more of a compromising position than Saudi Arabia is at this point. And I think there are competing voices within Syria. If there was a consensus that we can help, we want to moderate extremism, and of course their embassy in Beirut was bombed a couple of months ago, so there is that interest. Well, they have their ways of getting a seat at the table. But I'm afraid I don't see much sign that their policy is very pragmatic and flexible here either.
Anybody else want to add to that? All right, next question. Yes.
Andrew Conley, journalist. Should Israel join the nuclear negotiations, given that one of the biggest open secrets in the Middle East is their nuclear program?
Gentlemen.
No. I mean, the plain fact of the matter is you can't involve everybody in all negotiations. And what the P5 members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council and Germany are doing is totally transparent to Israel. It's also transparent to others who aren't present in the room, who think they might have a reason to be there, like Saudi Arabia. And the job of the negotiators at the sharp end is to ensure that at the end of the day, everybody can buy into this agreement. So one of the reasons it's so difficult is that not only Congress of the United States, which is probably the greatest single threat to success in the diplomacy, but also Israel, and at the other end of the scale, the hardliners in Tehran, have got to see that there's something in it for them that is better than continuing the standoff. But you don't have to be present in the room in order to be able to get your point of view across and to exert influence.
Can I rephrase my question?
Yes.
Why is Israel allowed a covert nuclear program?
Not a member of the NPT.
They're not that, yeah. The talks are about the talks are about the minutiae of the NPT, and having Israel in the room, who is not a member of the NPT and has really been a cause for nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East and South Asia, would make the conversation about something very different than Iran, I think.
The Geneva talks were never about nuclear weapons because Iran has always said they didn't want them and they're not making them and so on. So it may be sophistry, but that's the framework. It's not about weapons. And so the whole Israel question doesn't really enter into it.
But the basic position of countries like the United Kingdom is that Israel should, in due course, join the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. But we recognize as a matter of fact and practical politics that so long as Israelis perceive an existential threat to their state and to their people from a hostile environment, it's not going to be possible to negotiate away their nuclear deterrent. So it's not on the lips of every Western statesman every other day that ultimately Israel should be a non-nuclear weapon state, but that is their fundamental position.
I think it's also telling, very telling, that countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Turkey, in 50 years have not perceived a serious security threat from Israeli nuclear weapons at almost no point. But they have done so from Iran's program and its allegations of nuclear weapons research, which is a very telling fact, I think, because it tells you that they have not seen a threat coming from Israel in that sense, in a nuclear sense.
And it might tell you that nuclear weapons are no real deterrent because they cost the user of a nuclear weapons possibly nearly as much as the person who has got a nuclear weapon landing on their head.
They're unusable.
They're unusable.
Yes, sir.
There's been a lot of talk about, Danny Whitehead from British Council. There's been a lot of talk on US and Saudi and Israel. No one's mentioned the UK really yet. I want to know what you're reading of what's happening in Whitehall and Westminster. Is the UK doing enough? What more could or should the UK do to increase the likelihood of Rouhani succeeding in his possible moves towards moderation?
And I'd like to add to that, BP was actually on the list of the oil minister's 7 companies, major oil companies, that he wanted back in. So you have to think that pressure from inside BP must be ferocious to get on with it. All right, who wants to?
I don't think that would follow. The oil companies know perfectly well that it's illegal to go back into Iran.
But they would like to.
If they're invited to a meeting with the Iranian minister, what they will say, I suspect, maybe there's somebody from BP in the room, but what they will say is, you haven't a hope unless you change your contract terms. What you've got to do in the beauty competition for our investment funds that is engaged worldwide by all resource holders is tell us what you can do for us. Because we're not coming back in terms of the buyback agreements which Iran has put in front of oil companies because of their intense resource nationalism in the past. Now, the encouraging, for those of you who follow the oil story, and this oil story is going to be terribly important, the encouraging thing is that the Iranians realize that one of the current market leaders in the region for attracting foreign investment is actually their neighbor, Iraq. And they are interested in the production services agreements which the Iraqis have successfully used to get foreign investment into their extremely unstable country. But the answer to Danny's question is, I believe, that Whitehall is dead keen on getting a deal. It's working creatively in the framework of the P5+1. They will obviously listen to their Gulf commercial partners, to Israel, and they will want to stay in touch with the United States position. But that said, like every other sensible person, they see that the alternatives are useless for British interests. The alternatives are an Iran that does just what it wants, but under sanctions, in other words, no negotiation, or an Iran which is attacked and then does just what it wants because it's exempted by having been attacked from the international restrictions which it's prepared to commit itself to. Or thirdly, a negotiation. So naturally, Britain wants to test the negotiation. And I hope that the Council will come up with all kinds of flanking activities which will enable cultural and scientific cooperation, educational cooperation to develop just as soon as the Iranians are ready for it. And my suspicion is that they're not ready for much expansion just yet.
Yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This question is, I'm sorry, I'm Laura Kramer. I'm an associate producer at Documentary Production. Ramita and Kelly, this question is more towards you. Given the domestic economic pressure on Iranians right now, how are they feeling about what's happening in the changes? Are they accepting it? Is there resistance? Can we expect another uprising?
How are the people of Iran feeling about the prospect of change?
Exactly.
All right.
You could say it's in your book, it's fine.
It's not really. What I found really interesting is that the people who are most excited about Rouhani, who really believe they're going to see change, and who are the real fans of Rouhani, are the North Tehran, kind of posh, rich set, also the Epsom academics, some students. But the minute you leave North Tehran and South Tehran, people are pretty disillusioned. They feel very disenfranchised, and they're pretty hopeless. And I found that, so I spent a while traveling around the country recently, and I found that throughout most of Iran. And, you know, Iranians are famously very engaged in politics, and this was the first time that, that I'd encountered, the first time in a long time, that I'd encountered such hopelessness. So, you know, I'd ask, what do you think of Rouhani? What do you think? And, of course, the handshake had happened, and all the exciting things had happened. It was really funny, because there was a real disconnect between what I was seeing on my own Facebook page and my Twitter feed with all the excitement and actually what I was hearing on the streets of Iran. So you'd ask people, and I don't care. Until I see change, I don't care. You know, people are really suffering.
Because they're emotionally exhausted from the roller coaster of the last few years?
Forget emotions, because there are a lot of people who can't get enough bread on the table. I mean, really. So, you know, in the last year, 2 years, cheese has doubled, tripled. You know, the staples that a lot of people now cannot afford. So, until they see that change, and yeah, I mean, forget human rights as well. For a lot of people, they don't even care about that. They just want, bread on the table. They just, I mean, so a teacher earns roughly anything from between 600 to 800,000, which is what, about $200, $300
$300, yeah.
a month. Rent in Tehran, in an okay part of town, tiny one-bedroom flat, is about that. I mean, they're struggling. So many Iranians I met, not 2 jobs anymore. Before it was 2 jobs, taxi driver, whatever. Now it's 3 jobs. I mean, I met so many people who are just sleeping 4 hours a night. It's hand-to-mouth existence for a lot of people.
Kelly?
The pessimistic view is that both Rouhani and the establishment, the regime, manipulated the hell out of the situation and ensured the Islamic Republic would go on for another 8 years. And if anything, this might be a lot like it was during Khatami's period, where there was an opening because it was kind of the top of a pressure cooker that allowed some steam to come out for people to get out. That's probably what's going to happen again, and it's just a matter of time as the hardliners wait on the peripheries, waiting to, kind of come down on everything again. So, yeah, I mean, everybody does want change, and whether it's change that they need to see or change that is going to trickle into more freedoms to the North Tehranis, everyone's hungry for that, but the more pessimistic view is that.
I think it's interesting why Iranians are pessimistic, because from a reading from the outside, before I went to Iran, I spent 2 years there from 2012 and 13, and I would have thought that the Iranians would be very, very angry at the West for placing these sanctions on Iran's lifeblood, on the banking sector and the oil sector, which provides 80% of the oil revenues. Actually, though this anger it can be seen, they're more annoyed at the political classes in Iran. I mean, the apathy we have about the coalition, I mean, it's nothing compared to 8 years of Ahmadinejad. It's a very often quoted figure, but the oil revenues which Ahmadinejad earned during his 8 years is worth more than the entire 100 years of oil production in Iran. And this money was squandered on huge white elephants, social, affordable housing, which sounds amazing, but none of the contractors turned up, and everyone got paid for work they didn't do, and huge, horrible monolithic things on the side of a highway which aren't fit to live in, and the subsidy reform, which got completely eroded away by inflation. The payments they have to pay to the poor people in exchange for reducing the subsidy on gas and food. And this wasn't entirely Ahmadinejad's fault. It was the fault of having a completely collapsed currency which made imports, which Iran imports a lot of wheat and grain, really expensive. But people are annoyed at Ahmadinejad, and they don't suspect that the new guy is going to be particularly any different until they see concrete things on the ground. And that's going to take time. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take several years.
Well, what effect did the Geneva Accord being signed have immediately on the economy? The currency stabilized a little bit. What else?
The currency regained some value, and most importantly, it's plateaued. So businessmen can make expectations on future incomes, at least for a few months, which they couldn't do for a couple of years and at the end of Ahmadinejad's term. But Iranians are, as you said, extraordinarily politically engaged, but they see it as symbolic, which is a very fair reading. They don't see it as much more than symbolism. I think they're definitely happy of rapprochement with the West because they know what it can do. They just look across the Gulf and there was nothing there a few decades ago, and now the Emirates has risen out of the sands. So I think that's what they're definitely after that.
But how much domestic pressure is there for the next shoe to drop? I mean, for a deal to go even further, for some of the Iranian, international business to resume, some of the international oil exports to go.
Your question presupposes that there is a strong civil society, there is a strong democratic apparatus to press politicians to do anything, and In Iran, really, the elites run Iran. The elections, though, do have some democratic elements in them, are really just that they're just changing factions within an original system, really.
And if you look at sort of the pressure for a subsequent deal, the Supreme Leader said he wanted the next wise steps from Rouhani. But look at some of there's a vigorous debate within those elites about how far those next steps should go. One of the hardline newspapers, I think last week or a few days ago, ran a headline saying calling the Geneva Agreement nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
Trying to say this is an unacceptably serious curb on Iran's capabilities. And that's nothing compared to the debate we're going to have. I said we'd untangle the thorniest knot about Iran's right to enrich. But again, Rouhani, interviewed by Fareed Zakaria over the weekend, said he won't dismantle a single centrifuge. Now, Iran's running about 20,000 centrifuges. There's a lot of debate in Western capitals over how far that would have to fall, but I think there is some agreement it would have to fall, and it would have to fall in a reasonably irreversible way. So some degree of dismantlement would have to occur. Now, domestically, there are real obstacles to that, and you have to look at both the pressure from business and for commercial openings alongside that real concern about not giving away too much.
Another question. Yes, you at the back.
Isn't it actually because the actual is seeing Khatami came and nothing really happened, and we then had 8 years of Ahmadinejad, and now we've got Rouhani. So I actually sympathize with Iranian people in the way they are not political or are not engaging with politics as they've typically always done so, and that they've already seen Khatami actually led to a worse situation with Ahmadinejad. So what is there for Rouhani? What is there for people to think that Rouhani is going to be any better?
I'll say something really briefly. I completely agree with what you're saying. The reformists in Iran saw this failed experiment, and Khatami got eaten up. He got eaten up violently. There were political assassinations as well. But the one hope I think that the reformists do have is they've got a reformist-backed president who has the support of not only the reformists, but the hardliners. And this hasn't happened since Rafsanjani's first term after the war. Ever since then, Iran's been utterly polarised. And as I said before, nothing happens in Iran unless you have both sides on board. No matter how unpleasant we find the hardliners, the radicals, the revolutionaries, whatever you want to call them, they are needed to be taken forward. And Rouhani is the first person who's been able to do it in some 20 years. So it's not a very attractive position in terms of if you're a reformist who wants civil liberties and you want to be able to come and go out of Iran without getting harassment from the intelligence services. You want freedom of the press. But it is the only way Iran's really going to progress along the lines you hope for.
Yeah, and I agree with you. That is why so many Iranians are now apathetic and disengaged. But you're absolutely right. I've spoken to so many reformists who view Rouhani as their only hope, and who, exactly what you said, because he treads this line between reformists and hardliners. They see him as the perfect person. And also, there's a lot of talk within the reformist camp that actually, there's this either the implicit understanding with Rouhani and the reformists and the hardliners that he's going to, ease off civil society until parliamentary elections, because that is a worry as well of the hardliners, that parliamentary elections next year, that if he releases Mousavi and Karoubi, this is going to strengthen the reformists. And the reformists are also really aware of this. And the reformists I've been speaking to have been saying that we're happy to step back, to allow him to try and fix the economy, wait until the parliamentary elections, and then he's going to engage with us. I mean, this is one thing that I've been hearing. I mean, interestingly, I spoke to a really good reformist source of mine today who told me that there's a lot of talk that Karoubi and Mousavi will be released, maybe even by Persian New Year, which is March, and if not March, May. So, that there is hope within the reformist camp.
Can I just ask simply, why are the hardliners backing Rouhani?
Because
well, not all of them are
not all of
backing.
them are.
Yeah, I mean,
But
and the hardliners themselves are very divided.
Ahmadinejad's old allies generally, as a bloc, don't support Rouhani, but they have been completely discredited by their time in government. The new right, sorry, it's a bit wonkish, but this is Ahmadinejad's lot, really, the young veterans from the war. They have gone, and the traditional conservatives now have more political clout on the right, and they're the Bazaris, and the Bazaris want to make money, and they can't make any money, so this is why they're supporting Rouhani, because he's their best prospect.
Yes.
Are we seeing something very similar that happened with China, maybe in 2000, in terms of economic reform, and then maybe a basis for political reform later on? I don't know. What's your opinion directly on these?
Sorry, do you mind elaborating a bit?
In terms of, you were saying there wasn't any bread being put on the table and whatnot, and really there's this apathy to the whole political reform of things. Maybe these talks on could lead to an economic reform that could be very beneficial towards the people, that could then later on be a stimulus to this political reform that's needed for a better civil society.
And how much of a template is China in a way?
Yeah, as you can see, it's evident with what's happening with the whole exposure of the political corruption that's happening in the top levels, even though there's been a decade of double-digit growth within their economy, and strength within their value of the currency and the industrial revolution that they've had.
I just very briefly, but you're certainly right. There's people are going to still feel alienated until the economy starts moving again, and people aren't going to be politically active for some time in Iran until really things start moving. In terms of the Green movement, I really am reticent to even touch upon it, but political grassroots action in Iran from the left, from the reformist side, is almost non-existent. I don't mean to be too pessimistic about it, but I was there for 2 years and I hunted it out, and it's not really there. It was a strange confluence of factors which happened in 2009, but really, no one is going malnourished in Iran today. You need to have the poverty like you have in Egypt in order to respond to the political system in a kind of violent movement, revolutionary way. And it's not really the case to Iran, because for all its faults, it looks after the very bottom of its society. It's got a welfare state. It keeps people up, and that's why you're never really going to see that. It's kind of a separate point.
Anybody else want to tackle the China parallel or
I think
any aspect?
I think as long as the IRGC is so prevalent in the economy, most people are not going to view any kind of investment as something that's going to benefit them. And there was a recent corruption case that, Babak Zanjani, and when the establishment, the regime decided to burn him at the stake, and some of the details came out about the transactions and the alleged connections and corruptions. You saw how kind of things happen. Money comes, a few, get all the benefits, and people don't. So I think that's a big problem. That's a big obstacle to any of that.
Is it also worth making a distinction between political reform, which you suggested could be the next stage after economic reform, and lesser kinds of social and cultural reform, which are perhaps politically safer areas in which that opening can occur? I mean, the debate in Iran and Rouhani's achievements isn't necessarily primarily about political opening, and more about freedom of the press, which is obviously a political issue of social networks being unblocked, which again has political aspects, but is primarily a sort of cultural issue as well. And it's possible to imagine cultural openings without commensurate political liberalization.
Everything in Iran is very tricky and very risky. I think any little, thing can spark it. So I think everything is very political, and Rouhani has called for freedom of the press and how the role of the press in dealing with the corrupt society and everything. And right now, no one knows exactly where the IRGC intelligence unit is going to draw the red line, but the journalists are pushing, back, and the intelligence apparatus is showing its strength, that we're still there, but no one quite knows where it is. But I think that the people, the hardliners who are afraid of change and know that maybe, as you said, Iran is not reformable and anything can just kind of bring it down. Maybe that's why they were so sensitive towards, Mr. Netanyahu's reference to the jeans. I think he didn't maybe literally mean that people don't wear jeans in Iran, but it was such an interesting parallel to, the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's, and unfortunately, sometimes they use the cultural issues to mask everything else that is not Islamic about the Islamic Republic. So as long as people have to wear that, kerchief, then so they have a lot of sensitivity in that area. I wish that were the case. I hope.
I was in Geneva and I was struck by on one day, having covered these talks for many years, the Geneva talks were utterly different because Jawad Zarif is so easy in himself. He lived in America for more than 2 decades, and he and the team came in, and the chief negotiators spoke English. And they were available in the hotel corridors, and they were chatting to the Americans and the Germans, and it was incredibly open. I couldn't believe my eyes. And in fact, the chief American negotiator in one of the briefings said how difficult she felt that it was, because she was used in negotiations to say something and then have a lot of time because it would have to be translated, and then the answer would come back to her. And then she had a great 2 or 3 luxurious minutes to sort of think it out. And now it was going like this, and she felt it was much more stressful, much more interesting, in the end more productive, but a whole different ballgame. And yet, one day, Catherine Ashton's press guy is having a press conference at which he said precisely nothing. I mean, those press conferences were almost universally a waste of time. But the Iranian journalists, the press corps that had come with the Iranian delegation, had all gone in anyway because they were doing due diligence. And the Iranian press media guy came and herded them all out again. No, you don't need to listen to that sort of thing. Come on. So you saw the yin and the yang.
They're tweeting at the same time as well under the table. They're quick, those guys.
Competition between Alan Eyre, I think, and Javad Zarif on who's the best Twitter,
Yes.
Twitter and Facebook guy. They're both incredibly
extraordinary,
revolutionary, both from the American and Iranian side.
More questions? Yes, sir, at the back. Hi.
I think it's Iranian what's called demographic strategy. If you look at the whole picture.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, Iranian what's called demographic strategy. If we look at the whole picture, we see they have both short-term alliance and long-term alliance, like Syria and Yemen, which is based in population, is less than 10%, while in Iraq and Iran, it's more than 40%. So do you think in the future, when they're going to withdraw from Syria, we could give more support to Iraq and Iran? Do you agree with this?
Post-Syria, you're wondering how Iran will arrange itself once in the region once Syria is solved one way or another.
After Syria is solved.
It depends how they perceive the threat from other countries to them, in part. I mean, I think they do see the importance of their foothold in Syria from 2 viewpoints. One, they need to be seen to be supporting an ally, and I think that's why they were unable to endorse the Geneva I communique, because the universal interpretation of the Geneva I communique is that it requires Assad to step down. So they had to appear to be supporting their ally by not giving a commitment to Geneva I. And secondly, they will act in pragmatically adjusting their behavior by the nature of the threat they perceive. If the nuclear negotiation goes well, the next question which they are going to be confronted with is, well, how will you moderate your behavior in the region in order that the non-nuclear sanctions against them can be gradually wound down. Because if you think about the full panoply of United States pressures on Iran, only part of them are to do with the nuclear question. So the Iranians will be asked, what will you do about Israel? Will you be able to confront your own taboos about acknowledging that Israel is there in the region to stay? Could you, for example, adopt the policy that Malaysia has, in which there is no diplomatic relationship, but there is no attempt to deny the validity of Israel's existence? Similarly, they're going to be confronted with rhetoric, particularly about Sunni powers, Wahhabis as they sometimes call them. If you want good relations after the nuclear agreement, why don't you wind in your ideologues who continue to abuse other Muslims who don't think about Islam in exactly the same way as you do? And again, I think Rouhani would like to see that happen, but whether he will have the power to do it remains to be seen.
Yes, madam.
Hannah Smith, I work for a human rights organisation. This is a bit of an aside. How do you think the changing international relations with Iran will impact upon the Bahrain revolution, which has somewhat suffered from accusation of Iranian interference?
Well, just to start with that, I mean, yeah, so initially Bahrain's uprising.
Yes.
So how do you think...
Oh, yes. How will Iran's reforms have an impact on the Bahraini uprising and the human rights situation in Bahrain?
Well, so initially, as you're absolutely right, Bahrain's uprising was characterized as essentially a plot by Shia fifth columnists within Bahrain. Bahrain's own domestic royal commission found that its protest movement was not instigated by Iran, although in recent weeks, it's interesting, US officials have again suggested Iran has sought to put arms shipments into Bahrain, which is a charge that goes back 20 years or so, and I think elements of which are probably quite true. I think this is more a question of Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia and how defensive and vulnerable Saudi Arabia feels here. If it feels as though it is not on the back foot, and of course, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, this goes back to the other question as well. Their benchmark is 2003, when Iraq was Sunni dominated, Hezbollah was relatively weak, the Arab Spring had not weakened traditional Saudi allies, and so that partly motivated their activism in 2011, sending forces into Bahrain and urging no compromise there, a stance which has slightly shifted since then, I think. An improved Saudi-Iranian relationship would perhaps allow Saudi Arabia the space to try and push their Bahraini allies, some would say clients, into a more compromising stance towards the opposition there. And I think they have shifted somewhat in that direction over the past year as well, as they've seen how the divisions in Bahrain have become so much wider. They would also hope at a later date that Iran could make some concrete gestures there. And this isn't about instigating the rebellion, but for example, broadcasts. They complain about Iranian broadcasts into countries like Bahrain, which are incitements to rebellion, that they would see this as, from Iranian satellite television stations. So those are potential areas of discussion. But on the whole, I think most of this will be determined by Bahrain's own internal dynamics. The Bahraini-US relationship has been really strained, and that hasn't changed Bahrain's calculus. They still have taken a very uncompromising stance, and it will really depend on their own internal balance of power between the Crown Prince, the King, and the Prime Minister within the island itself, and I don't think the omens are particularly good.
Yes.
Can I ask, Nigel Pearce from the Elders, can I ask a question slightly related to yours, which is about Ali Shamkhani and the role that he's playing now as head of the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and whether you think he has the will and the ability to improve relations with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states.
I haven't a clue. I met him twice, actually, when I was ambassador, and he's a formidable military leader and a formidable intellect. And he's got a lot of credibility in the Iranian system. But how he wants to use those assets as the Iranian situation evolves has not become apparent, because I know of nobody who has reported on any meetings with him.
Can I just add a word to that? I mean, there's no shortage of potential Iranian interlocutors with Saudi Arabia. I mean, the names are kept coming with Shamkhani, but also people like Rafsanjani and others. I think the issue is more, it's not a question of do you have the right people to talk to Saudi Arabia, it's what are you talking about? And the enormous difficulty in just getting Iran close to the table for the Geneva talks over Syria shows you, I mean, the gulf between these two sides is, I mean, sorry, unintended pun, is so serious that it's difficult to see how it'll be narrowed without progress on Syria first, preceding it, rather than following it. I mean, you've seen no shortage of PR outreach. Zarif has written op-eds in Arab newspapers that say all the right things, although the interesting subtext is, why do you need the Americans? We can build a decent relationship. The Americans are only spawning things in the region. If you only kicked them out, we could solve everything very fast indeed. There's also been some interesting signs about potential UAE Iran progress on their island disputes, which of course potentially drives a wedge between the UAE and Saudi Arabia as well. But I think it's not really a question of who is there to talk to the Saudis, and the Saudis have people in return. They allegedly invited Rohani to perform Hajj in Saudi Arabia as well. It's more the agenda is just so intractable.
Yes.
I'm just curious to ask Anu, what do you think will be the significance of having Mousavi and Kahroubi released in terms of the green movement?
Question is, what would be the significance of having Mousavi and Kahroubi released?
Nobody knows what their intentions are, and that is part of the problem, in that it's a terrible risk for the regime to release them. If they are irreconcilable to the system now and are not prepared to accept guidance from their seniors in the system, namely the supreme leader, about their political behavior, then they could be a rallying point for discontents and for those who want to see the Islamic Republic change. And I don't think the question can be answered. They haven't been able to express themselves. There are rumours that they have been invited to say that once released they would not engage in political activity, and there are rumours that they declined to give any such assurance.
I completely agree with your comments, but on the flip side, to look at it from the security services and the Supreme Leader's office perspective, by not releasing them, it really shows that you haven't moved on from 2009, and it shows that you still feel this. By keeping them in prison and showing that you feel they are a threat, it shows you to be weaker. And I think that there is a kind of pressure on the Supreme Leader to acknowledge that that is the case and really move forward and break from the past.
Supposing they were released, tomorrow both of them are out.
I think it's impossible to tell how much of a rallying call they will be for the reformists. From my perspective, I can't imagine the streets of Tehran would be filled with people supporting them the day they came out. People are a lot more practical than that at the moment.
I agree. Every time Rohani speaks at a university, though, you get huge parts of the crowd shouting, "Release the martyrs." In fact, I was there just before Christmas when Mandela was dying, and they were shouting "Mousavi Mandela, Mousavi Mandela." I mean, there's a kind of I think it must be difficult for him every time he exposes himself, because it's obvious that they are highly symbolic, and the more he doesn't release them, the louder they shout.
I think it is exactly as you say. It is symbolic. The people who are shouting "release political prisoners," at least the majority of them, from my reading, want Iran to become more of a we. It's not the people who are supporting the people in prison and the people who want them in prison. By releasing them, everyone will be back together, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly why it is important, because it is symbolic, and it also will signal that Rouhani has the power to change, the power to release them. And as you were saying, they are clearly seen as a threat, even though, as you were saying, the Green movement is all but dead. You know, they are still perceived as a threat. And I think I mentioned that, you know, so it's a fear, apparently, that if they do release them, that the reformists, however dormant they are, will be strengthened before the parliamentary elections. And of course, the hardliners are very keen that you know, Rouhani doesn't gain ground in the parliamentary elections. And he has been publicly backed by the reformists.
Aren't the parliamentary elections in 2016?
Next year.
15.
I think 50, yeah.
Are you sure about that?
They're usually 4 years apart. The last one in 2012.
Yeah, so I think it's 16.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I thought it was
So if
next year, maybe.
no, it's a year
it's
after.
next Persian year.
Yeah.
It's the year before the presidential election.
We've probably got time for one more question. Who'd like to toss it our way? Nobody. All right, then. Well, in that case, thank you all very much for listening, and thank you to our panelists for some really insightful and provocative comments. I wish you all a very good evening.